For decades, the world has remembered John Lennon as a symbol of peace, a voice that challenged power, inspired change, and paid the ultimate price. But behind the scenes, John Lennon may have been a man quietly falling apart. And now, 44 years after his tragic passing, we finally understand how Yoko Ono, his wife, and the one woman who stood by him through it all, truly felt about his passing. It turns out that John Lennon's death may not have been completely unexpected. He had enemies, he had doubts, and he had a chance to walk away, but he didn't. And when you hear why and what Ono revealed, it will change the way you remember John Lennon forever. The man behind the legend. John Lennon's life on the outside looked like it was filled with the luxury and glamour of fame, but behind the scenes, his story was completely different, and the events that led up to his death are so dark and eerily connected. Throughout his life, John Lennon faced countless battles and challenges. And one of the earliest challenges he had to deal with was the tragic death of his mother when he was just 17 years old. John had a strong connection with his mother, even though they didn't live together. She encouraged his interest in music and taught him to play simple songs on the banjo and ukulele. She introduced him to the sounds of early American rock and roll. That influence stayed with him for the rest of his life. However, tragedy struck. In 1958, she passed away after suffering from a tragic accident. Her death devastated him, but it became a turning point for him, emotionally and creatively. That loss hardened some parts of him and deepened others, and this showed up in his lyrics over and over again, especially in his solo career. And even before the world knew his name, John was already carrying the kinds of emotional experiences that would later give his music its depth. In 1960, John Lennon co-founded the Beatles, a band that would go on to completely redefine music forever. Alongside Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, Lennon. But John Lennon wasn't just one-fourth of a successful band. He was one half of one of the most legendary songwriting partnerships in history. The Lennon-McCartney duo was responsible for the majority of the Beatles' catalog. Their collaboration was rooted in McCartney's melodic optimism, paired with Lennon's more introspective, raw edge. Lennon's style was direct and emotional. He didn't shy away from uncomfortable topics. He sang about identity, isolation, confusion, and longing. Even when wrapped in catchy melodies, his lyrics often asked difficult questions, because he wasn't just writing songs to entertain. He was writing to express, to process, and sometimes to provoke. And as the Beatles' fame skyrocketed, Lennon became known not just for his music, but also for his outspoken personality. He wasn't afraid to criticize institutions or speak his mind, even when it sparked backlash. His interviews often made headlines, and his offhand comments sometimes turned into international controversies. And sadly, this would become the beginning of Lennon's exposure to threats and danger. By the late 1960s, Lennon had become a symbol of creativity and honesty for some, while for others, a symbol of rebellion and disruption. He constantly challenged the expectations placed on him and on the band, and he always pushed back against the idea that pop stars should stay quiet and polite. Lennon was never one to chase approval, and this constant push against boundaries, silence, and comfort would shape his choices, his music, and his personal life in the years to come. And while the world came to know John Lennon as a Beatle, and later as a cultural icon, very few truly understood the personal weight he carried from his early years. But John Lennon's story took a sharp turning point the moment he encountered the woman that would completely change his life in an art gallery in London. Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono. John Lennon met Yoko Ono in November 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London. It was an art exhibit, and Ono, already an established avant-garde artist, was previewing a piece titled Yes Painting. To view the artwork properly, visitors had to climb a ladder and peer through a magnifying glass to reveal the small word written on the ceiling that read, Yes. For Lennon, it was more than clever. He found it unusual. But what got his attention was a sign in the galley that read, Hammer a nail in. Lennon immediately asked Ono if he could really put a nail in, but she refused because the main exhibition was scheduled for the following day. However, after being persuaded, she agreed to it, and afterwards, they had a conversation that sparked something very powerful. Their connection wasn't just about mutual interests, it was instant, intense, and emotionally charged. Lennon was still married to Cynthia Powell at the time, but the foundation of that marriage had long been cracking. Yoko offered him something different. With her, there was intellectual stimulation, creative freedom, and a deep sense of emotional intimacy that Lennon hadn't found elsewhere, and it wasn't long before they became inseparable. Their relationship quickly turned romantic, and by early 1968, Lennon had left Cynthia. The emotional connection between them was so profound that Lennon once said, "When I fell in love with Yoko, I knew, my God, this is different than anything I've ever known. This is more than a hit record, more than gold, more than everything." As Lennon and Ono grew closer, tensions inside the Beatles began to crack the foundation of the band. Ono reportedly began attending recording sessions, often sitting silently at Lennon's side in the studio. Reports later revealed that to the other Beatles, it felt like a breach of the creative dynamic that had once thrived on privacy and shared focus. But Lennon didn't see it that way. He saw Yoko not only as his partner, but as his artistic equal. When the Beatles finally disbanded, most fans and media outlets painted Ono as the villain. They saw her as the outsider and an unconventional artist who had somehow invaded the Beatles' world and disrupted the fragile balance within the band. She was Japanese, older than Lennon, and uninterested in conforming to public expectations. And for most people, that was enough reason to cast blame. Lennon himself once said that meeting Ono was like a young guy meeting his first woman. You leave the guys at the bar. You don't go play football anymore. You don't go play snooker or billiards. Despite the intense love and connection, their relationship wasn't free of pain or missteps. One of the most damaging incidents came in 1972 during a party in New York City. The event was hosted by activist Jerry Rubin, and it took place around the time President Richard Nixon secured his re-election. The mood of the night was already heavy for many guests. Lennon became frustrated with the political climate and began drinking heavily. At some point in the evening, he disappeared into a bedroom with another woman, leaving Yoko alone in the living room. What made the situation even more humiliating was that guests trying to leave the party couldn't retrieve their coats. They were in the same bedroom where Lennon was loudly, unapologetically betraying Ono, while she sat there, hearing everything. People tried to stay quiet and tried not to look at her, but the damage had been done, both privately and publicly. The man who spoke so often about love and peace had acted with carelessness, and it left a deep wound. By 1973, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Ono told Lennon that they needed space. The relationship had become strained, chaotic, and in many ways, toxic. She suggested that he leave New York and spend some time apart. Lennon took her advice and moved to Los Angeles, beginning what would later be known as his Lost Weekend, a period of nearly 18 months filled with parties, chaos, and temporary distractions. During this time, Lennon began a romantic relationship with May Pang, a personal assistant who had worked for both him and Ono. According to multiple accounts, including Pang's own, Ono had essentially approved the arrangement, seeing it as a less destructive alternative to total collapse. But while Lennon appeared to have freedom, he was also falling apart. In Los Angeles, his drinking escalated. He was kicked out of nightclubs, got into public fights, and was even arrested for heckling the Smothers Brothers during a comedy show. Although he still recorded music during this time, his personal life was spinning out. Interviews from that period revealed a man who was unsure of himself, insecure, and trying to outrun emotional pain with loud nights and blurred memories. Finally, in 1974, something shifted. Lennon began reaching out to Ono again. The conversations were tentative at first, but became more regular. Despite everything, the emotional connection between them hadn't disappeared, and in 1975, Lennon and Ono reunited. This time, things were different. Shortly after reconciling, Ono became pregnant with their son, Sean. Lennon was 35 at the time, and the arrival of a child marked a new phase in his life that he hadn't experienced with his first son, Julian, from his previous marriage. Lennon made a conscious choice to step back from the spotlight. He took a break from music, stopped touring, and dedicated himself to being a present father. He cooked meals, changed diapers, and stayed home, something few imagined possible from a man who had spent over a decade in the chaotic eye of global fame. His love for Ono deepened during this period. Their relationship, once marked by turbulence and constant scrutiny, found a quieter rhythm. He began to speak about her not just as a muse or collaborator, but as someone who had saved his life more than once by challenging him, by walking away when necessary, and by standing by him when it mattered. This wasn't a fairy tale romance. It had its failures, its betrayals, and its long silences. But it endured, and that endurance gave Lennon the stability he hadn't had in years. In the years leading up to his death, Lennon frequently described himself as content, not with fame or fortune, but with his role as a father, a partner, and an ordinary man trying to live peacefully. But his relationship with Yoko was not the only challenge that Lennon had to face. In fact, throughout his life, he kept confronting the one thing that had followed him his entire life: himself. Lennon's personal struggles. John Lennon once stood at the center of the most famous band in the world. He was wealthy, worshipped, and widely considered a genius. But even as millions screamed his name, Lennon often felt like a drifting, isolated, and uncertain man battling demons most couldn't see. Despite the groundbreaking success of the Beatles, and later his solo work, Lennon struggled deeply with self-doubt and depression. The highs of fame brought moments of joy, but they also came with an unrelenting spotlight and crushing expectations. In interviews, he often spoke about feeling trapped by his image. He was hailed as a visionary, but constantly criticized, picked apart, and misunderstood. Fame didn't protect him from emotional lows. In fact, it often made them worse. He had periods of feeling disconnected from everything, including his music, the people around him, and even himself. Lennon was searching not just for peace, but for purpose, and that journey would often take him into darker places. Throughout the early 1970s, Lennon became more politically vocal than ever. He was deeply opposed to the Vietnam War and took his activism public. He held bed-ins, a form of protest that required them to sit in bed for long stretches of time with Yoko Ono. They appeared at anti-war rallies, and he used his celebrity status to call out injustice wherever he saw it. But his activism didn't go unnoticed by the United States government. President Richard Nixon saw Lennon not as an artist, but as a threat. His anti-war stance and influence over young voters put him on the radar of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. In fact, from 1972 to 1975, Lennon faced a relentless campaign to have him deported from the United States. The Nixon administration believed that if they could silence Lennon and if they could get him out of the country before the 1972 election, they could quiet a voice that had grown too loud. It was a deeply stressful time. Lennon had made New York his home, and he feared losing it all. His immigration status became a legal tug-of-war, dragging on for 3 years. During that time, Lennon couldn't relax. He couldn't plan for the future, and he couldn't escape the growing paranoia that he was being watched. Documents later revealed that he wasn't imagining things. He was actually under surveillance. His phone was tapped, and his movements were monitored. Fame had given him a platform, but it also painted a target on his back. As these pressures mounted, Lennon's personal habits began to deteriorate. His use of substances had become a way of coping with anxiety, mood swings, and the overwhelming weight of fame. This habit wasn't as widely publicized as some of his contemporaries, but it quietly took its toll. It affected his relationships, clouded his judgment, and, at times, widened the distance between him and those closest to him. Even years before his activism, Lennon had courted controversy. In 1966, during an interview with a London newspaper, Lennon made a remark that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now." The comment, while intended as a reflection on changing youth culture in Britain, was taken completely out of context when it reached the United States. The backlash was swift and explosive. In America's Bible Belt, radio stations banned Beatles music. People held public burnings of Beatles records and merchandise. Lennon received death threats. There were calls to boycott the band's upcoming tour. In the midst of all this, Lennon issued an apology, not for his beliefs, but for how his words had been misunderstood. Still, the damage was done. It left a scar, and it made Lennon more cautious about what he said and who was listening. But perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of Lennon's personal struggles came not from critics or the press, but from his own reflections. In a 1980 interview with Playboy, just months before his death, Lennon admitted something many artists might never say publicly. He spoke about his past behavior in stark, painful terms, admitting that he used to be cruel to his woman, keep her apart from the things that she loved, and physically maltreat her. He acknowledged it as a shameful part of his past, something he had worked hard to unlearn. By the time he made that admission, Lennon had spent years in therapy, meditation, and self-reflection. But he knew the truth of who he had once been, and he didn't shy away from it. For a man so often seen as a peace icon, it was a reminder that even the most revered figures have shadows they carry. Through all the awards, headlines, and screaming fans, John Lennon remained someone still trying to figure out how to live without hurting others or himself. He had found love. He had found fatherhood. But peace remained a daily struggle. And just when it seemed like he was finally settling into something softer and real, the past came knocking. The tragic assassination. By December 1980, John Lennon had retreated from the chaos of the spotlight. He had re-emerged into public life slowly, releasing new music with Yoko Ono and embracing fatherhood with their young son, Sean. He was living a quieter life in New York City, tucked inside the Dakota, a grand, Gothic-style apartment building overlooking Central Park. But this peace, for John Lennon, would prove heartbreakingly short-lived. On the evening of December 8, 1980, Lennon and Ono were returning home after a long day at the recording studio. It was a routine walk into the entrance of the Dakota, one they had taken countless times before. Just hours earlier, a young man had approached Lennon outside the same building. He was holding a copy of Double Fantasy, Lennon's recently released album. Lennon, as he often did with fans, paused and signed it. There are photographs from that moment. In them, Lennon looks calm, generous, and even cheerful. He had no way of knowing that he had just signed an album for the man who would kill him. That man was Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old from Hawaii who had once been a Beatles fan. Over time, his admiration for Lennon had curdled into something dark. Chapman had become obsessed with Lennon's perceived hypocrisy, and he began wondering how a man who preached peace and unity could live a wealthy, privileged life. Chapman's mind had grown increasingly unstable, and he began to see Lennon as a symbol of everything false in the world. And he began planning the murder for months. Chapman had flown to New York days earlier, carrying a firearm and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a novel he claimed inspired him. In his twisted thinking, he believed that by killing Lennon, he would make a statement that would align him with the book's disaffected protagonist, Holden Caulfield, a character famously obsessed with calling out insincere people. Chapman wasn't just targeting a man, he believed he was correcting the world. That night, as Lennon and Ono walked past him into the Dakota, Chapman pulled out his weapon and fired at Lennon's back. 4 of the bullets struck him in the shoulder and in the back. Lennon collapsed on the steps, while Ono screamed. But the most twisted part of the tragic incident was the fact that Chapman didn't flee. He simply stood nearby, pulled out The Catcher in the Rye, and began reading as if nothing had happened. Within minutes, Lennon was placed into a police cruiser, as there was no time to wait for an ambulance, and rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. The officers who carried him described him as unresponsive, Medical staff tried to revive him, but the wounds were too severe. John Lennon was pronounced dead shortly after, and he was just 40 years old. The news sent a shockwave around the globe. Crowds gathered outside the Dakota, lighting candles, singing songs, and weeping openly. People couldn't process it. The man who had spent a lifetime preaching peace, who had walked away from fame to build a life rooted in love and art, had been hurt just outside his home. For fans, it was more than the death of a musician. It was the silencing of a voice that had shaped an entire generation. Lennon had challenged the world, its wars, its violence, and its narrow thinking. But in the end, he became another victim of the very violence he spent his life denouncing. Chapman was arrested at the scene and later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He has remained in prison ever since, repeatedly denied parole. Over the years, he has expressed remorse, but for many, the pain of Lennon's loss has never fully healed. In the days that followed, Yoko Ono made the decision not to hold a public funeral. Instead, she asked fans around the world to pause for 10 minutes of silence. On December 14, 1980, that silence stretched across continents. In Central Park, tens of thousands gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed in a tribute that required no words. John Lennon's murder wasn't just an act of violence, it was a moment that marked the end of an era. For those who grew up with the Beatles, who believed in Lennon's message of change through music, it felt like history had taken a wrong turn. He had flaws, certainly, but he had tried to be better, to challenge systems, to love more deeply, and to live more honestly. And in the end, that journey was cut short by a man he didn't know, with a motive no one could fully understand. But what if this terrible public tragedy wasn't as unexpected as we all believed? What if someone had sensed it coming? Because someone who had stood beside Lennon through every storm had warned him long before that December night. Yoko Ono confirms. She warned Lennon. In the months leading up to John Lennon's murder, an eerie sense of danger had begun to surround him. Yoko Ono, who had always been deeply intuitive and sensitive to the energies around them, later confessed that she started to sense that something wasn't right. This wasn't paranoia. These were real concerns, some based on actual messages passed to her, others rooted in patterns that had grown too disturbing to ignore. At the time, Lennon had only recently returned to the public eye after 5 years of self-imposed silence. Between 1975 and 1980, he had stepped away from music completely. He became a full-time father, rarely leaving New York. When he did re-emerge, with the release of Double Fantasy, it wasn't just a musical comeback. It marked a shift back into the spotlight, a place Lennon had never fully trusted. Yoko Ono reportedly began receiving warnings from acquaintances and friends in their spiritual circle. Others came from spiritual advisors who had been close to the couple for years. According to people close to Ono, she was told more than once that danger was near and that John should consider leaving New York for a while. She listened, and in the summer of 1980, she urged Lennon to take a trip to Bermuda alone. It was, in many ways, a gentle push to get him away from the city and the energy that was beginning to feel increasingly unstable. Lennon agreed and sailed to Bermuda aboard a small yacht. The trip was rocky, but he arrived safely and spent time writing songs, reflecting, and reconnecting with himself creatively. He later described the Bermuda trip as a deeply spiritual experience, and some of the songs on Double Fantasy were written during this quiet escape. But when it came time to return to New York, Lennon refused to stay away. To him, the city represented freedom. He had fought hard to be allowed to remain in the United States, especially during the deportation battle of the 70s. New York had embraced him as one of its own, and Lennon often said it was the first place he felt free to walk the streets like anyone else. The idea of leaving permanently or even living in fear didn't sit well with him. When Ono relayed the warnings again, Lennon dismissed them. She later revealed that she had shared the predictions directly with him. One particular message had been clear. Lennon was in danger, and something terrible could happen if he remained in his current routine. Ono urged caution, but Lennon's response was firm and almost resigned. According to Ono, He insisted that if something was going to happen, it would. You see, Lennon had lived with her for years. From the time of the Beatles' rise, Lennon had received countless death threats. After his 1966 comment about being more popular than Jesus, there were radio bans, protests, and public burnings of Beatles records. The FBI monitored him for years due to his anti-war activism, and he had long lived with the knowledge that his outspokenness came with a price. Ono, however, saw something different this time. She believed the energy was becoming more ominous, but Lennon kept moving forward. He returned from Bermuda revitalized and eager to complete his new album, and despite her misgivings, Ono stood beside him, supported the project, and returned with him to the Dakota. They resumed their daily life. Lennon often walked the streets without bodyguards. He visited local cafes. He greeted fans outside the apartment, and one of those fans would eventually be Mark David Chapman. In retrospect, the warnings feel devastating. For Ono, they were never vague hunches. They were actually deeply troubling specific messages, and she had done what she could to act on them. But Lennon made his choice. He refused to live in fear. He believed that art and honesty were worth the risk, even if it came at a high personal cost. After the tragedy and Ono's revelation of the warnings, many would begin questioning whether anything could have truly changed the course of events. But even as the world mourned and the headlines faded, not everything added up. The circumstances surrounding Lennon's murder and the events that followed left behind a trail of unanswered questions that were too strange to ignore. Many have asked how someone like Chapman, who had shown signs of obsession and instability, was able to get so close to Lennon. Why was there no security at the Dakota that evening? Why were the earlier spiritual warnings not taken more seriously? And most of all, was there any way it could have been prevented? Although Yoko Ono has confessed that she tried her best to avert the tragedy, her intuition, as strong as it had always been, had also left her with a deep sense of inevitability that she had hoped would never become reality. Lennon's legacy lives on in music, in activism, in art, and in the ongoing conversations about what his life and death really meant. But for Yoko, and for many who loved him, one question still lingers. Could it have all been avoided? What do you think? Was Lennon's death inevitable, or could history have been rewritten? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.